See, Saul is on the hunt for David, and this is just west of the Dead Sea. It's in the middle of nowhere. It's a wilderness. It's really harsh conditions. And so Saul ended up in one of these caves in the area that dot that whole area. If you've ever been able to be over there, it's incredible to see it. And it just happened to be the cave that David and his men were hiding in. Now, David's men read the situation, and they saw this as God's providence, that God would deliver Saul into David's hand to finally rid himself of this constant death threat against David's life. He's got an opportunity. That's why they said what they said in verse 4. Look again. Here is the day of which the Lord said to you, behold, I'll give your enemy into your hand. You shall do to him as it shall seem good to you. Like they looked at the situation. That's the way they were certain that they read the situation correctly. This was God's will to free them from this threat. Was it though? Because David had a different interpretation, right? Even though he had every clear opportunity to take Saul's life in that cave, he merely cut off a part of Saul's robe. Now, to us, that's not that big a deal. Like just a little piece of fabric, but many believe that it meant more than just David showing Saul that I could have killed you and I didn't, that it meant more, that it actually alludes back to chapter 15 when Saul was with Samuel. And Samuel told Saul that God was taking the kingdom away, and Saul grabbed his robe and it tore. And Samuel said, hey, that's what God's doing with the kingdom. He's tearing it away from you. That this in some way alludes back to that moment, because that robe that Saul was wearing, it was a symbol of the kingship. It was something that showed that he was the only one who could wear it. It was probably had some nice fringes on the edge of it. That was the way often those kings looked at the time. And that's why I think David was so convicted by this act that he did. Verse 5, it says, David's heart struck him because of what he had done. Why? Because David cutting off the corner of the robe could have been construed that it was a symbolic effort to take the kingship by force. And he says, the robe is mine, in a sense. That he was pushing Saul off the throne and taking this position himself. That's the way it could have, and I think that's why David was really like, oh, I shouldn't have done that. Because that's what people would have read into it. And so what we learn again is David was sensitive to God's work in his heart. He's continuing to prove himself more and more worthy. He's growing in his trust that the Lord's going to work all this out. And so he's settling into that reality. That's why we see verse 6 as an example. Look at what David said in verse 6. He said, the Lord Yahweh forbid that I should do this thing to my Lord, little L. He's talking about his Lord, the King Saul. He's still respectful of the position. He calls Saul the Lord, Yahweh's anointed. The Lord forbid that I should do this, to put out my hand against him, seeing he is the Lord's anointed. Again, David respected, understood his fear of the Lord was bigger than his fear of Saul. We'll see even more later as we get to the dialogue later in the chapter. But David knew, again, Saul had been anointed by God as well. Even though Saul was showing his true colors, he was trying to kill David, he was showing he wasn't truly following the Lord, but David feared God enough not to take Saul's life. Because the command was don't touch the Lord's anointed. And so David respected that, knew that, feared God enough that even though it might have seemed providential, that God had provided Saul right in front of him to kill him, to take Saul out, David did not want to take revenge.